Hi, this is Paul. I want to talk about narrative and data and background. And I'm going to drop that little clip from Local Distance, not the latest conversation I did with him, but the one before that talks about basically how intelligibility works in human beings. There were a lot of different elements of the Friday live stream that caught my interest. Nathan came in and Nathan gave us an account of his view of the world. And as was unsurprising, given the variety of perspectives and positions, people sort of, engaged with him a little bit in the comment section. Chris Young, regular part of the corner, said Nathan had all the classic labels and tropes himself. And Nathan then says, "Can you engage with the content of what I said rather than responding as if you've been Pavlovian conditioned to react to words you disagree with by turning your brain off and moaning?" Well, this is, of course, the basic assumption of what happens along both sides. There was another comment. I wish that Nathan actually responded to the arguments of Thomas Sowell. In other words, Nathan says, well, engage with the arguments. And the other side says, well, engage with the arguments. Walter Williams and Glenn Lowry's of the world, who are social scientists of various types, have criticized the outcome of various government interventions meant to help people that have unintended consequences. Yeah, I recommend a 6-hour series on Soul by Unlearning Economics, PhD in Econ. But, there's there's so many PhDs around, as if having a PhD sort of makes all of this go away. Well, it never does. And then Smith History said, I wasn't impressed. I don't think I was able to get through the whole thing. If I remember, it seemed a lot like lefty talking points. So usually you have this conversation of narrative and data where people say, well, if you just pay attention to the data, then the narrative emerges. But of course, we know that in order to actually apprehend data, we have to do so usually with a narrative that sort of simplifies it and puts it in a whole and orients it in sort of in space according to us. And this is where sort of the epistemic revolution that is underway, and in some ways the death of facts comes in. And let me just drop the point that Wokel makes with respect to sort of the background and our ability to apprehend is not directly connected to this point, but it actually is important to this point because this is how we operate. We don't actually just sort of take in facts. Facts become these data points that work within narratives, and then we have these construals, and these construals sort of make really large postures, let's say. And these postures get boiled down in the United States because we have a two-party system. These postures sort of get distilled down into left and right. So in a recent video, I mentioned this video from Dark Matter, where, again, I think it's actually a sign of progress that we see people who have been sort of new atheists realizing that religion is a much more complex thing, and they're beginning to notice that the actual religions have a lot to do with sort of this narrative data dynamic, and then the narrative being boiled down into, let's say, a side, and that these sides sort of become these, well, we can call them spirits, we can call them various other names.
Close the border and maintain border security. Deport those who are here illegally, welcome those who go through the immigration process properly. Stop sending money overseas, cut our taxes, stop wasteful spending, replace the Department of Education with school choice. There are only two genders. Protect women's sports and women's spaces from men pretending to be women. Men and women are naturally suited to serve different roles in society. Such roles are informed by tradition. End DEI, end wokeness. Racism isn't really a problem anymore. Where it is a problem, it's usually against white people.
So you get the point, and then you can sort of go to political group B.
A social construct. The absence of women and racial minorities from professional groups that are predominantly white could be the result of bias or discrimination, so DEI initiatives are a good way to combat that. Racism is still a problem. LGBT people should.
So you have these political group A and B, but that's sort of how we reduce the world and simplify the world and say that there are really two sides. For many years, I've talked about the fact that consciousness is sort of monofocal, which makes binaries very salient to us. And it's also part of the reason why 3s and 4s begin to sort of confuse us, because there are too many things to sort of imaginatively watch, even in our exapted consciousness frame. Because the truth is, if you sort of watch people and you begin to realize that, well, while there seem to be many people who have sort of reduced things down to political group A or political group B, and you can sort of map this onto other things. The based camp people call it the urban monoculture, and there's very much sort of an urban rural. Because the world is so complex, we tend to look for flags and clues so that we can sort of very quickly sum up a person when we meet them and sort of reduce them into group A and group B. Now recently, a man who, I don't know if he actually lives in the same city that I do. They do have a mansion up in Carmichael. If you really want to have an interesting tour when you come to Sacramento, you can tour the old governor's mansion, which is still in the city. It's like this historic Victorian. It's a beautiful building, and the tour is fun. I don't know if they still the tour, but apparently he's ripped off my YouTube moniker. Take a listen.
This is Gavin Newsom.
This is Paul. This is Paul. This is Paul. This is Paul. I've been doing it for years. He's right down the road. Gavin, come on. Knock on the door of Living Stones. Step over the homeless people. And so he recently had an interview with Charlie Kirk, and it's controversial because a whole bunch of people that I know are like, he never should have talked to Charlie Kirk. He never should. But I was thinking, Gavin Newsom just went up in my mind, and Gavin Newsom is not a stupid politician. Gavin Newsom has an inkling that if he actually wants to be the next resident of the White House, he's probably going to have to meet a lot of Americans sort of in the middle. And so it's basic. It'll be very interesting that he's sort of heading towards the center right now, perhaps in anticipation of what he's going to have to do with his presidential campaign. But, in terms of, for, what I can think, well, good on you, Gavin. I got an estuary protocol. I'll let you use it for free if you actually want to have conversations with people. Here, let me get a quick, something for the thumbnail here. So I think I will listen to it because I'm really very curious about their conversation. And he apparently the big thing that Newsom got in trouble for, Newsom agreed with Kirk's stance that it's deeply unfair for transgender women to compete in girls' sports, a position that has drawn backlash from progressive Democrats and LGBTQ plus advocates. So that was, I guess, the big moment when Newsom conceded this. But again, we have all this sort of narrative and data thing, and one would imagine that Newsom must be where's the thing? Newsom's political group B versus group A. Now, this Sunday morning, this Sunday in California is what I call jet lag Sunday, because whereas in October, where everyone gets an extra hour of sleep, that's one of the best attended church services of the year, and people come in happy, and they've been waiting for church to start. And Estuary, we had a really good turnout that week in Estuary, and people were raring to go at the early hour of 9 a.m., which is early for some people, but not for some of our living stoners that wake up at 4 or 5 a.m. involuntarily. And the older I get, the more I'm like that. But on Jet Lag Sunday, I was like, is anyone going to show up for Estuary? And it was the regulars. It was the faithful. And they were there, and they were ready to talk, just like they are every Sunday. And two of the pitches were very interesting, because one pitch was somebody talking about the fact that when he's able to get below this sort of political group A, political group B, when he's able to get below this layer, people are way more interesting, because people are sort of adopting these political layers as identities, and they're sort of garments of skin, let's say, that people are wearing. But when you start to dig down beneath the surface, they've got stories and reasons why they might not believe, and ways that they no longer sort of align with everything that's on the political group A, political group B list, and reasons that they break orthodoxy in one way or another. And I've seen this forever as a pastor, because even though someone might be a member of the Christian Reformed Church, they've got these ideas over here that don't necessarily line up with all those ideas over there. And I've always just taken that as normal for people. So that was one of the pitches, was the person saying that he's increasingly being able to sort of see through the hard shell narrative that we very quickly project onto people. And once you begin to see through it, you begin to notice, oh, well, they've got plenty of things that they sort of break from narrative in this way or that. And then the world is just a much more interesting place. And another person pitched, this other person quite regularly attends other meetups in Sacramento that are political or philosophical in nature. And he gets so tired of the hard shell narrative, low resolution posturing of people. And he talked about one friend, I likened it to C.S. Lewis, friend one, who agrees with everything and likes the things you like. But friend two, like Owen Barfield with C.S. Lewis, who like disagrees with all kinds of things, but you love arguing with them, because for some reason, when you have that sort of productive play, it's much more fun. But he also expressed just frustration with these polarized narratives and low resolution reductions of people into these groups, when you begin to discover that, well, actually people are not just sort of the sum total of all these things. Now, one of my favorite Substack writers is Ryan Burge. And Ryan Burge was a minister, and his church went belly up. But he's got a pretty, he's got, 19,000 Substackers. And he often looks at religious surveying. And like one of the articles that he points out is just recently, which religious traditions are most politically knowledgeable. And actually, as it turns out, the atheists tend to be the most politically knowledgeable in many ways, and I think partially because their atheism is their religion. But then, let's see. Here we have the chart. So atheists tend to be on top. Mainliners are quite high. Mainliners, however, are in real trouble. White Catholics, white evangelicals are actually quite high. But many people, Muslims, don't appear to be paying any attention to political details, probably because they're so new, and Hindus are way out here. So it's a mixed bag. But again, you still have the issue of data and narrative. And the reason we have narratives, again, is because we sort of have to reduce everything. There's way too much data in the world. You have combinatorial explosiveness. And even if you do a lot of research and you do a lot of study, if for whatever reason you're very emotionally committed to your narrative, now that sounds to some people like, well, that's irrational. I don't mean it in that way at all. I'm thinking much more Master and his emissary, Ian McGilchrist, that actually there are reasons you're committed to your narrative. And they don't necessarily have to do with the data, and they can be data notwithstanding. And what's so interesting is that this used to be sort of what people would talk about with respect to religion. They would say, oh, people are just committed to their religious narrative. But as it turns out, people are committed to all of their narratives, because they have to be. And I remember Jordan Peterson talking about at one point, this was back when he had that presentation at Liberty and had the conversation with the chaplain at Liberty. And we were talking about transformations. And he was talking about the fact that people have a very limited number of transformations that they can actually fit to in their life. And he talked about the fact that some of the people that he grew up with and knew in northern Alberta had never had a significant transformation where their narrative changes. It's just all the data continues to come in and fits into their narrative. And it doesn't mean that their narrative is necessarily a bad narrative, because probably in some ways they haven't had a transformation because their narrative works well enough for them, that the data can sort of shape. And usually people change their narrative when it's sort of like the history of scientific revolutions, when there's a revolution that happens when a certain type of data, and it's usually not sort of emissarian data, because emissarian data that's sort of way out there is usually highly theoretical. It's usually much closer to home. It's like when a divorce happens or there's a major betrayal in their life. It's in a much more Vervaekean 4P way that something has to give. And so you need to change your axioms, and you need to change your narrative, and you need to change your worldview in order for other pieces of your life to work. And again, I seldom find that it's all of the thinky-talky data points way up here. It's actually the stuff way closer to home. And, it's for that reason that for a lot of people, let's say, they grow up in a religious household and it's their sexual orientation. That's a really difficult thing to sort of deal with. And if you look at someone like Becket Cook, who, I should pull up a thing so I remember to put it in the comments, because someone will invariably say, who are you talking about? So you look at someone like Becket Cook, who, if you listen to his story, and there's a book about it, and it's a fine book, sort of grows up in a very liberal household and then becomes a Christian, and he has this transformation, and now the data with respect to his same-sex orientation and his same-sex attraction and all the assumptions that has sort of flips the other way. Of course, Rosaria Butterfield is the same way. But you can find other people, like in the Christian Reformed Church, Ryan Struck, who has, they've grown up in a religious household and they fought it, and eventually for them it just seems easier to flip, become affirming, and then all the data seems to work better. But of course, life's a long time, and people actually have multiple transformations. John Vervaeke is just done. I'm by no means all the way through it, but it started out so lovely. Rafe Kelly and John Vervaeke just had a recent conversation, and John said this, and it really caught my attention.
I'm going to be doing next year, the filming for it and the production of it. And then I don't know where I'm going to be after that, to tell you the truth, Rafe. I mean, I'll still be your friend. I know things like that, but I don't know where I'm going to be and who I'm going to be. And I'm just trying to, in service to the philosophical Silk Road, I'm trying to stay as open and as vulnerable to transformation as possible.
Yeah, I think it's
that really struck me, and doesn't surprise me at all knowing John, because John has always been, if someone wants to say they want to really be data driven, I mean, that's John. John takes data super seriously. And so, he's just being very open. But as Jordan said way back when, again, the whole Liberty University was talking to the chaplain of the Liberty University, and we're talking about transformations, most people have a limited number of transformations that can actually happen in their life. And as Jordan said, some of the people he grew up with, they're the same person their whole life long. And usually for them, that in a sense works for them in sort of this dead reckoning sort of way. And they're able to, works in what way? They're probably able to have stable relationships and able to be married to one person their whole life and live in a community with the same friend group for themselves their whole life. Because it's usually these kind of really foundational relational relationships, contextual things that are most important to us as human beings. And I think it's probably for that reason that we have this sort of bifurcation between rural and urban, because urban centers are so polyvocal that that itself is going to shape a particular set of axioms, and also it's going to filter in and filter out certain temperament types and personality types. And so there's going to be a lot of movement with respect to this. So Burge has this article on, well, which religious traditions are the most politically knowledgeable. But again, that knowledge tends to be all this little emissarian type, Amazon type little Amazon box data points. One of the interesting things that came out of the Friday live stream too was that you would think that Nathan and Anselman in the comments section would be like on opposites, because Anselman is a traditional Christian man, conservative. Nathan has been through a few transformations in his young life. Nathan, I spent a little bit of time with when I was in the UK. I had a wonderful time with Nathan. He came to the sort of the estuary leaders group, and he participated in the UK estuary group. And in person, I've always had a lovely time with Nathan. He's always been wonderful to get along with, and he's been, he's just showed up in a very personable way. But when it comes to, let's say, Gaza, Anselman and Nathan are on the same page. And it's so interesting because you get these moments, like these single issue voter moments. Just recently on Maiden Mother Matriarch with Louise Perry was talking to Megan Murphy, and they had and this segment caught my ear.
Think of I really wish I had a pithier term for this, because this is kind of clunky, but I think of this category of feminists as single issue TERFs, in the sense that they're basically progressives on absolutely everything except this one thing. I don't want to give them a really hard time, because they are obviously right about the trans thing, but I find this worldview frustrating, because it just seems so implausible to me that progressives would be right on everything except this one very glaring thing in which they're super, super wrong. Like, to me, it seems like it really undermines the whole ideology. But I would say that, like, I don't know, a good majority of TERFs are single issue TERFs. That's at least my impression from looking at Twitter and so on.
Yeah. And it's really frustrating because progressives are not right about everything, and they're actually these days wrong about most things. And ironically,
and of course, Megan Murphy, had her own transformation. If you don't know who she is, I don't know her that well. I didn't listen to the whole thing. There are a couple issues that I want to kind of dig down and drill that she sort of teased in the beginning, but. And this is where, I was thinking after the Friday Estuary live stream, and then before the Sunday morning Estuary Saturday, I was thinking about narrative. And then when this one individual came in and said, I've really been working hard on basically looking past people's, I'm going to put different words than he used, looking past people's narrative representations. One of the things that Ryan Burge very regularly writes on his Substack is he does a lot of research with respect to churches and the overlap between churches and political issues. And one of the things that he writes fairly consistently on is that, contrary to what has usually been sort of an American left trope, which imagines that, well, all these conservatives are there in their evangelical churches and they're just reinforcing all their conservative evangelical tropes, and these just become like little bastions of hatred against marginalized people, yada yada yada. What he finds is that actually it's people who don't go to church that tend to be more, that tend to fall victim to, let's say, low resolution narrative representations. Because when you do go to church and you're actually around people with lots of different aspects, that you discover that you thought that person was a hardliner. But on this issue over here, they break with sort of the political ideological orthodoxy. And, Anselman, in the corner of the, let's say, the activist bazaar, Anselman and Nathan can meet over on the, Stand Up for Gaza section. And you'd be like, Anselman, how about that, huh? We kind of expected it out of Nathan, but Anselman comes burning through the comment section on that issue very regularly. And so what Ryan Burge has noted is that among people who actually go to church, they're much more flexible with respect to this whole business of position A and political group A and political group B. They're much more nuanced. Because they actually have to participate with others in a very tactile way, where there are other high commitment values that mitigate against sort of becoming single issue people in one space. And that's what's so interesting, because depending on what the conversation is, Nathan and Anselman will divide in all sorts of ways. But then when Gaza comes up, whoop, they're both over here. But then something else comes up, whoop, they're over there. And this, again, is where sort of consciousness is kind of monofocal, because, if you're a little bit crafty and you begin to realize these realizations and you're a little manipulative, you can actually sort of move people around the room. Because a lot of people do wear their buttons on the outside. And once they wear their buttons on the outside, it means that if you're just sort of paying attention, you can push them. And all you have to say is Gaza, and whoop, there they go over there. And it's like, well, let's move them around a little bit. Let's talk about same-sex marriage. Whoop, now they're over there. And now let's talk about, because once you've sort of mapped all the irregularities in the political groupings and know them beneath the surface, and if they're still sort of highly reactive, you just move them around the room all day long, because you know what all their issues are. And that makes them actually rather easy to manipulate, if that's what you're into. I actually find those manipulative games rather dull. I find the exploration games much more interesting, because when I find something that, let's say, Nathan and Anselman, or let's say T-Grog and Anselman, or let's say MJ and Anselman can agree on, then it's like, oh, well, that's interesting. And that's why it's sort of fun to have a really diverse group around you, because then you sort of throw different things into the mix and see how sort of the iron filings begin to arrange themselves. And that's why it's fun to have a diverse group around you and to play with a lot of ideas, and also to sort of be appreciative and open and inquiring. It doesn't mean you don't have your own positions, but if you have sort of a little bit of restraint, well, you don't have to blab your whole positions the whole time, and you don't have to let other people's positions dictate how you treat them. And that's actually a pretty potent superpower, if you can learn to sort of keep a hold of yourself when some big issue comes in the room, instead of just wearing your buttons on the outside and letting everybody push them. And then, as this one person in our local estuary, the point that he made, and I completely appreciated his point, part of what's cool about estuary, we had this conversation on CRC Voices quite recently too, because someone had made the observation. I've been a part of like similar groups to estuary, and I've noted that actually when you sort of have a process that sort of opens people up, they actually become more amiable and open to other things. And because of who this person is and how they have presented themselves on Voices, at some points everybody just sort of assumed a certain political ideological track, because certain people are very activistic, and they sort of align up with these political groups, and again, once they sort of present their cards like that, well, then you can start to play them a little bit, because you say, because we're so used to all of this boilerplate. All you have to do is say a certain line about Gaza or abortion or Trump or something like that. And again, you just watch all the iron filings rearrange themselves. And again, if you're prone to being really interested about how people perform in groups and who they are and how they react, well, you can play with people all day with this kind of stuff. But if you actually also care about people, then you can also know that's really handy information, because then you can talk about an issue, but then, we're not going to talk about this, and I'm not going to use those trigger words, and I'm not going to do this, because then suddenly you can have a bigger conversation, and you can discover where they are heretics of their own orthodoxies and what they actually believe. And then if you begin to get to know them, you can often begin to discover how these deeper issues down below, which are sort of manifesting themselves in these other issues up above, well, maybe find out what hurts are below there, or what passions are below there, or what things are below there, so you can actually sort of meet them in a much more, I think, interesting and pleasing space. And actually, I think that's a really good reason to have an estuary meeting, because, well, if you're a Christian, your master commands you to love your neighbor all the way up to and including your enemies, and that includes your political rivals. And the question is, well, how do you love your political rival when you have all these data points and pressure points and buttons on the outside, and they just keep pushing them? Well, you're probably going to have to learn to sort of modulate some of these buttons a little bit and be a little less reactive and hold on to yourself a little better. And maybe, okay, so they might disagree with you on a bunch of these points in the political groups, as dark matter calls them, but maybe find some other places where you line up, where you can be together. And again, churches, this is part of the reason with Ryan Burge that churches actually tend to foster more political moderation, and I would argue in some cases even some religious moderation, because again, in many churches, if you actually get to know the people that are going there, they're by no means pure. Lots of people have lots of ideas about all sorts of things. And let's say in an estuary context, if you actually create a space in which people are courageous enough like Gavin Newsom, who's decided it's in his political best interest, who's only got 11,000 subs. I'm bigger than him right now. Another 2 weeks, he'll be bigger than me. But it's just super interesting for me watching the dynamics of Gavin Newsom, who has political bona fides for the left, but not everybody, a whole bunch of people are upset. And again, it's so funny because I hear this. Oh, everyone's upset at Gavin Newsom because he talked to Charlie Kirk on his first interview, and so that's the game we're playing, huh? Thou shalt not talk to thy neighbor. Thou shalt reduce thy neighbor to a thin narrative exoskeleton and strawman them and pigeonhole them and never get to the soft, squishy parts underneath where the exoskeleton is actually being formed, and not understanding that when they molt and they form a new exoskeleton that might be politically opposite of what it was before, that's also connected somehow to that person, that narrative-based person way down below. And again, if you have a master named Jesus Christ and you hear that he commands us to love our neighbors all the way up to and including our enemies, you might want to adopt a strategy for talking to your adversaries. Now, I don't know what's behind Gavin Newsom. I celebrate what he, well, shoot, 500,000 views on that and 11,000 subs. He clearly didn't say like and subscribe. But I'm interested. He's my neighbor. I mean, he works in that building. It's just a few miles in that direction. And again, as my friend in our local estuary said, everything is just, I just find, I don't remember exactly what word he used. He basically said that I'm not going to give up seeing people in this new way because it's better. I was watching an episode of Love is Blind with some of my kids, and they'd gotten to the wedding portion of Love is Blind. Love is Blind is the show where men and women are in these pods and they talk to each other without seeing each other. And then once they sort of propose marriage, then they get out of the pods and see each other. Then they go on a vacation together, and then they live together for a couple of weeks. And then they bring them to the studio where they're going to do the wedding. And then on the altar, they have to say, I do or I don't. And in this particular episode, there were like 5 couples, and the first 4 were all I don't. And 2 of the 4, the main reasons for I don't were from the women. And these women are like in their 30s and they're watching their biological clock and they really want to get married. But what they didn't like was the politics of the dude. And right now, of course, everybody's saying, well, women are going more progressive and men are going more conservative. And it's like, you know, there have been surveys that have said, on the average, people are way more open to their children marrying someone of another race than another political party. And it's like, oh, our politics have gotten that religious, have they? Not a good thing. So there's women out there that are probably never going to have children or never going to get married because they can't relativize their politics well enough to actually negotiate and maintain a relationship with a guy who I would imagine the vast majority of his life pertains not a whole lot to that political group A or B. And many of these people were religious, and apparently part of what the one guy said to her is how does your religion impact your voting? And she was highly offended. I would imagine that she was a medical doctor and perhaps, you know, it was abortion that they were on opposite sides of, because the men were because they get in the pods and they're like, they find someone else who's also a Christian and they take their faith serious, like, yes, yes, yes. But then their politics trump their religion, and so it's just an admonition to, you'll find them up in the channel. You'll find them on the corner. You'll find them who have different political views, different from what you do. Look beyond that narrative exoskeleton. And you don't have to love their politics. Jesus doesn't say, love your neighbor's politics. Jesus says, love your neighbor. And it's not something that, I often say that loving your neighbor is not advanced Christianity, it's basic Christianity. It's, even though we're really bad at it. It's no secret that most of us are really bad at basic Christianity, even if we are Christians. But it's one of these things that you actually have to grow. Again, it's like a piano. You can have a piano sitting in your house and you say that piano is capable of beautiful music, but it's going to take practice. And that's what I see estuary in this little corner. And I mean, this is for the practice. And people will behave poorly. People will have bad practices. And I know some of you, there's a couple of you out there. There's not very many. There's 2 or 3 of you that I've banned for comment section because, well, first of all, you don't show up on screen. And when you do just show up on comments, you don't know how to do it well. And at some point, I'm like, yeah, after a number of years, you don't need to disrupt this group anymore. But for those who actually show up and play and relate, and in doing that, demonstrate a willingness to grow in their capacity. And I know some of you have names that you're thinking of right now and say, I know. People are not their narrative shells. They're narrative exoskeletons. All right, that's enough for this video. Got to make a thumbnail.